I will very shortly be introducing our keynote speaker. A few housekeeping items that you've seen flashing before the screen is please mute your lines. Please mute your computer sound as well as your telephone if you're using a telephone device. We would like to say thank you to Methodist Healthcare Ministries that's made this program possible today. The program today will allow for questions and answers at the end. So if you'll submit your questions via chat, we'll work our way through, our speaker will work her way through and answer those at the conclusion of the program. So make sure that you can submit those anytime as we're going through the program. And be reminded that in order to receive CEU credits, you must complete an evaluation at the conclusion of the program today. If you have any further questions, please contact the Ecumenical Center at 210-784-7653. Without further ado, it's my distinct honor and pleasure to introduce our speaker today, Dr. Rita Nakashima Brock. As she is a Senior Vice President and Director of the Shea Moral Injury Center at the Volunteers of America and a commissioned minister of the Christian Church, Disciples of Christ. An award-winning author, she is a co-author of Soul Repair, Recovering from Moral Injury After War, which was published in 2012. Another publication, Saving Paradise, How Christianity Traded Love of the World for Crucifixion and Empire. This was published in 2008. Proverbs of Ashes, Violence, Redemptive Suffering, and Search for What Saves Us was published in 2001. Also another publication, Casting Stones, was published in 1996. And Dr. Brock authored Journeys by the Heart in 1988. Dr. Brock was a professor of religion and women's studies for 18 years before becoming, in 1997, the director of the Bunting Institute at Ratcliffe College, a program for distinguished women scientists, social scientists, scholars, writers, artists, and humanitarians. A member of the strategic planning team that negotiated in 1999 a merger of Ratcliffe with Harvard, and she then became the director of the fellowship program at Ratcliffe Institute for Advanced Study at Harvard University. She has a distinguished past, and we are very honored today to introduce to you Dr. Rita Nakashima Brock, who is our keynote speaker. Please welcome.
Thank you. Can you all hear me okay? Is the sound all right? Good. All right. I want to thank the Ecumenical Center for inviting me to do this workshop and lecture today. It's been since COVID a while since I've had to prepare a series of lectures and or talks, and so it's helped me actually organize my thinking around the work on moral injury that I've been doing for the last year. My project has been mostly hands-on, but I'm trying to organize what I've been doing and think about it into another book. So any suggestions that you all have about things that might belong in the book from what I say, or things that don't seem very clear that need elaboration, I'm really open to feedback. I like good editing and feedback. It's been a really interesting intellectual project to put this together into a coherent presentation. I hope it makes sense. Before I start sharing my PowerPoint, I just wanted to say a little bit about how I got into this moral injury work, because it's not sort of the likely career path I was on when 10 years ago I was looking at possible administrative positions in theological education and thinking about becoming an administrator, when I put together a Truth Commission on Conscience in War as part of my sort of hobby, not a hobby exactly, but avocation. as a peace activist. And in the process of organizing that Truth Commission, some VA clinicians in Boston had been working on a concept called moral injury, and they were writing an article on it, and they actually sent it to me and my friend Gabrielle Latini ahead of time before it even went to press, so that it would inform our work at the Truth Commission. And it was so definitive and clear that this is what the commission was all about, that we gave it to everybody testifying and to all 95 commissioners. And out of that Truth Commission came a recommendation that there needed to be vast public education, especially of religious communities, but of the general public and veterans, about moral injury, that it was that important a concept. So that's how I sort of launched into the work. And I decided that that was a good mission for probably the last job I'm going to have, or the last part of my adult career, is work on moral injury. And it has a personal resonance for me. It is actually, the work on moral injury has actually changed me personally, because I was raised by a stepfather who was in the US, a career Army NCO, whose first military assignment with the 1st Infantry was Normandy in World War II, and whose second war deployment was at the end of his career when he did 2 tours as a medic to Vietnam. And it was the Vietnam experience, his second tour, that so changed him that I didn't really want to be at home with him anymore. And I was already in college at the time. And so I just sort of did my best to stay away from him. And realizing that now I know something about moral injury, that is clearly what had happened to him, that had so changed his character. And it's actually changed my relationship to my memory of my father. I really rethought what a good father he'd been and what the war had done to him in a way that has healed in some ways a broken relationship that's been broken for a very long time. So my interest in moral injury isn't just academic or professional, it's also deeply personal. So I'm going to start my PowerPoint now. Okay. Here we go. So can you see my screen with the PowerPoint now? Okay, yay. So I'm going to share, the first thing I want to do today is to share my starting assumptions. When I talk about moral injury, I think it's helpful to begin with a sort of set of assumptions that I think inform the way I think about moral injury. And the first one is something I've come to from working with the social scientists and psychiatrists who work on moral injury, who aren't particularly religious and aren't inclined to make universal generalizations about human nature. And yet I heard a number of them who have actually no interest in religion or philosophy, who are just hard-nosed psychologists and psychiatrists. They say they believe that human beings are born moral. The content of what morality means is a different thing, but that we all have this capacity called moral conscience. And I call it a condition because it's also a vulnerability. It's a strength and a vulnerability at the same time. It's a strength because morality is how we maintain relationships of love and care that are how we flourish in life. Through love, and that's an important human strength. But its vulnerability is that reality is quite chaotic and unsafe. So that's my second assumption. Reality is huge. We only manage it collectively in cultures and societies with meaning systems that help us filter out a lot of reality. We receive billions of messages all day long through our brains and sensory apparatus and our thinking processes. And to manage all of that, we have filters, and those filters are our meaning systems. And we usually operate as adults within a number of meaning systems. It's not just one. There may be a core one that sustains us through all the other ones. But generally, we're different at work than we are with our best friends, and we're different with our families than we may be with strangers. And we may have institutions that we belong to that have different clubs and associations that have slightly different meaning systems. And so we generally operate with several, with maybe one primary one that begins early in our lives. So moral injury is devastating, but it's also an ordinary human experience of moral failure, not a mental health disorder. I'm very clear about that. You actually have to have a working conscience to have moral injury. So it's not a disorder, it's an affliction of conscience. But moral injury is related to trauma, and it can be experienced alongside other traumas, like PTSD. And PTSD is often the one people think of when they hear moral injury. They say, well, how's it different from PTSD? And I'm going to hope you can answer that question by the end of this workshop. But it's not PTSD, although it has some overlapping symptoms and can sometimes be mistaken for PTSD. And this is something that Bill Nash, who works at the Greater Los Angeles VA as a psychiatrist, is careful to say that if you are working with a veteran that's got a PTSD diagnosis, you need to listen carefully, because it's likely that there's moral injury in there as well. And if you don't know what to do with the moral injury, you can leave it worse or just not addressed. So PTSD and moral injury have a tight relationship often, but they're not the same thing. And finally, my last assumption is every society, religion, and culture has had to figure out what to do with moral injury. They didn't necessarily call it that. They might call it mortal sin, or they might call it suffering, but they have terms for what it means to violate your conscience so drastically that you feel like a miserable person. And they have rituals and processes and ways to think that try to address moral injury. But as Kent Drescher, who's a VA clinician and a Presbyterian minister, has said in one of his essays, what the content of how a religion addresses moral injury, the content of that actually can make it worse. So not every a religious approach to moral injury is a way to recover from it. It can actually deepen it. So not every answer is a good answer. Some are more effective than others. I don't know that you would call them wrong. They're all attempts to try to help, but they can sometimes make things worse. So I'm going to start by just explaining why moral injury is so devastating by talking about how we construct our morality. It's not a simple thing. When we talk about morality, we usually confine it to discussions of ethical principles, like number 3 on this list, rules, and 2, meaning constructs. But I believe that morality is encompassed by all 5 of these aspects of human life. And so I'm going to explain what I mean by these. They're habits, meaning constructs, rules, rituals, and experience. So the first is habits. These are the unconscious body memories, these behaviors that we start to imbibe the minute we're born. We actually have a neurological system so we can mimic other people's behaviors. And we may not even understand the meaning of them, but we get reinforced in the good ones when we get approval, and the negative ones are discouraged. It doesn't mean you automatically learn not to do the negative ones, but you learn to begin to feel your way into behaviors that get you love, attention, and empathy. These behaviors are deeply embedded in our neural systems with the physiological body that actually enacts these behaviors. And once they are habitual, then they're habits. They're just, you don't have to think about them. And as Aristotle says, we are what we repeatedly do. Excellence then is not an act, but a habit. And I think one of the habits that some of us have had to learn recently, which is never something I never thought in my life I would need to have as a habit, is always picking up a mask when I go out my front door. And yet it is now a habit. I walk out and I think, wait, I forgot my mask. And these days I hardly ever forget it, but that is, it's not something I spend a lot of time mulling over. It's just now a habit. They're hanging by my door. And in fact, when I'm out and about and I'm indoors somewhere and somebody isn't wearing one, I had to immediately have a negative reaction. So even simple habits have moral content. So we often talk about etiquette as if it were something trivial around politeness. But our habits and the ways we treat each other all day long, 90% of the time, we don't even think about, but they have moral content. You automatically know how to address a stranger. If you turn around and step on somebody's foot in a line, you generally automatically have some kind of apology or something you do to make sure you didn't break their foot or cause them intense pain. And those are habits. They're so habitual that if your foot got stepped on and somebody did that in front of you, and if they just completely ignored you and didn't apologize, you would make a moral judgment about them. Just an unconscious moral judgment. So habits have moral content, and they're important because they're really most of the ways that we are moral all day long. They're just habits, and we learn them from childhood forward. The second category were meaning constructs. And I think I got that a little over to the other side too far, but their definitions of reality, that filtering system I talked about, a meaning construct, so that you can take enough reality in to make sense of life and to have relationships and function in the world. So language is one of those crucial meaning constructs, and our brains seem to be hardwired for it. So even children, as they begin to acquire language, they just intuit the rules of grammar, subject, verb, possessives, that sort of thing, that you eventually learn to have language for, but we already internalize those structures even before we even understand them. So you'll often hear a child mistakenly use the possessive his's because somehow they figured out that a possessive has an S on it. And since his is a word and it needs an S to be a possessive, they'll say his's sometimes. So it's like, why do they do that? It's a strange thing, but they just know that possessives have S's on them. Language is also how we know we belong to other people and a culture. And generally language comes, the meaning structure, the filtering system we have comes with some kind of religious structure. That doesn't mean that everyone that has that structure is religious. A person can have no real interest in religion, but they still have a meaning structure, and often that meaning structure in their culture has been shaped by a bedrock religion. And I think in the United States, that sort of substructure for a lot of people who aren't religious is monotheistic and often Protestant. So often if somebody says to me, I'm an atheist, my first question is, tell me the kind of God you don't believe in. And they have a concept of God. It's like, well, where did they get that? So it's a cultural thing. So meaning constructs are important and they're limiting. So you cannot have a meaning construct that becomes universally applicable, for one thing, because there are so many diverse languages and languages carry meaning. But if you look at the cartoon of the man looking at the two signs, you can either choose the meaning of life or you can choose cheese and crackers. That is funny if you know what cheese and crackers are. But it's not very funny if you're from a culture that doesn't like cheese and doesn't eat cheese, which is a lot of East Asian cultures. So even something that seems obviously funny to us carries a particular cultural context that we share that would make that cartoon a little bit funny. And the same with the poster on the side there with all those religious symbols, which is interesting. It's supposed to sort of represent some of the religious diversity of human life, but half of them are Christian in some form. You can see all the different crosses, and the crosses represent some religions that are just tiny compared to, for example, there's only one symbol for Islam. So you can see that and see it's coded from a Western point of view. And probably from a Christian point of view, and it was created by the United Church of Christ, but you didn't even need to know that there's a predominance of Christianity in that poster. And so the third thing that determines our moral behavior are rules. And rules are a function of meaning systems, but they have a very important role. Rules are impermeable boundaries. Rules are things, if you break them, there is a severe penalty. So in large societies of impersonal relationships in many institutions, it's usually the rules are made into law. They're written down. So you have we the people, which is over to the, I don't know, the far end of the slide, we the people, that's a picture of the front page of the Constitution. So in the United States, we are organized as a society's rules of law. And those laws tend to represent ideals, like what does it mean to have a peaceful, just, and good society where everyone can pursue happiness and be free. So those are ideals. The laws are meant to try to uphold those ideals. As we know, the Constitution leaves women out and makes Black Americans 3/5 of human beings. The Constitution wasn't perfect. It's been in a process of being amended, I think 25 times now, in order to fix some of the things that were not there that should have been. But rules impose order. And they make claims to universals, like all people, men originally, all people are created equal, whatever that means. But that's a universal claim, everybody, nobody's excluded. But often universals are based in a particular society's differentiation between what is customary, what is legal, and what is moral. So what is customary may not be moral, and what is legal may not be customary or moral. It's sort of interesting how you have those various ways of regulating rules. But for large cultures, it's often laws. In small cultures that are like indigenous cultures, it's often oral. People transmit by memory the rules of the culture. And there was a really interesting example of this when the huge tsunami hit the Indian Ocean a decade or more back. It was a terrible tsunami. It killed thousands of people along the shores of the Indian Ocean. And there was this little island out in the middle of the ocean. It only had a few hundred residents that lived fairly simply fishing and as they had lived for a very long time. And they only had one person die, even though they were mostly at sea level. And that happened because one of the older people in the community saw the ocean go out a mile away from the island, which is like unheard of. And as soon as he saw that happen, he yelled, "Run for the hills." And he forced everybody to run to higher altitude. And so the only person who didn't make it was an elderly man who couldn't walk, and people weren't able to carry him to get him out of there. So he drowned, but everybody else was saved. And so this elderly man was interviewed about how he knew to do that. And he said, well, when I was a boy, I was taught by the elders that when the serpent swallows the sea, you have to run for the hills. They had not seen that in their lifetimes, but he knew the rule. So he told them the rule and they obeyed. So rules are really important. The first list you see is the Buddhist Eightfold Path. That's kind of what they require for ethical behavior. So you have to have the right attitude and right intention, to be moral in your speech and action, and even in your livelihood. And in right effort, mindfulness, and concentration are the last three that are part of the meditative practice that take you to enlightenment. So if you don't get to step 8, you don't get to enlightenment, you just come back and you get another chance at the Eightfold Path with a new life. So that's what karma means, is that you have to keep at it until you get it right. The 10 Commandments, the list that I posted there is the Christian version. If you know the book of Exodus, there are several versions of these commandments. And so Christians have sort of settled on these 10 as the 10 Commandments. But rules like this are extremely important for understanding what lines in a culture you may not cross, what makes you a bad person in the culture if you cross them. And then there are rituals. So for Protestants, this is a bit puzzling. I'm a Protestant, and we don't spend a lot of time talking about rituals. We talk about worship and sermons and hymns and things like that. But we don't necessarily put our minds around, well, what is this? What, if it's a ritual, why is it a ritual? And rituals are important because they allow your imagination and your existence to operate outside of ordinary time, outside of historical time, within a space where there is a flow of time, but that flow of time is not structured by a clock. It is structured by the ritual itself. And the ritual is often enacting some kind of narrative arc, a beginning, a middle, and an end. It may even be based on a story. And so inside those parameters, what's called liminal space, outside of ordinary time, and usually even outside of ordinary space, usually you create a space for ritual to happen, is a place that you actually can not be so tightly attached to your ego. So it can override personal sincerity and teach you habits that override your ego. One of my examples for this is in my Protestant tradition, there's usually some time of passing the peace, and people mill around and shake hands and even hug people they know, but you're supposed to shake hands with everybody you cross paths with. So in the time of passing the peace, people will often wind up shaking hands with people they don't know at all, or people that they don't like very much in the congregation, but that what you sincerely feel isn't very important to that habit of passing the peace. And some people might call that hypocrisy, but I see it as it's a way to override your own personal opinions and to try to aspire to be the community that you're enacting in the passing of the peace, rather than how you personally feel. But that's one function of ritual, is to teach you a habit that might override some of your worst instincts. And it enables you to imagine that reality by acting it out as a reality. And that's part of what's called the subjunctive mood, or as if quality of ritual. It can actually help you be a better person by you're learning the habits by enacting them over and over in ritual. It's a socialization process. So ritual is also, and this is crucial in understanding moral injury, is that it's a way that ambiguous things, change, differences, and all kinds of the chaotic forces of reality that we try to keep at bay with our meaning system, it's permeable to those ambiguities in a way that makes it easier to take them in, because it creates a container for taking in chaos rather than just having chaos take over. So what are those chaotic forces that almost every religion has some kind of ritual for? Well, there's death. And in many cases, people actually can't adequately grieve until they get to the memorial or funeral service. They may be trying to get ready to do it, but death is a major ritual that almost every religious tradition has some way of dealing with. It's often a ritual process for taking in strangers, adopting them into a community. It's a way to handle sickness. There are plenty of rituals around birth. And then there are moral failure rituals. In the Christian tradition, it's called penance. And rituals also are a way to manage often violence. So these three rituals at the bottom are all what are called transition rituals. So they're rituals that take a person from one state of existence to a new state of existence in the community. And the first two are adolescent transition rituals for girls. The first one is a bat mitzvah, which is relatively new in Judaism, that they have always had bar mitzvahs for boys, but they've added girls in. And so this is a bat mitzvah, but it isn't just for adolescents. I have a 64-year-old woman, a friend in her 60s. I think she was 64 when she had her bat mitzvah, because she had been a secular Jew and she decided to join a synagogue. And so she went through a bat mitzvah in her 60s. So it's still a transition process. The second one over is a ceremony that the Pueblo Indians use, this one may be Navajo, to do the same thing. An adolescent girl goes through a whole ritual process of running for days and cooking corn cakes and doing the kinds of strong things that women in the community do, that is the role of an adult female. Even though she's not quite of the age to become an adult female, she's already been transitioned to that role by acting out the functions of it. And then of course the last one is a Christian baptism. And if you didn't know the symbolic purpose of that, you might think this was a scene of somebody trying to drown someone. So the content of what the ritual means is really important to the enacting of the ritual. And then the last thing that I want to talk about is experience. And that's when reality hits up against meaning. And it can be a creative process. You can experience wonder at something you've never seen before that you have to learn to take in. It's also, our experiences are often curiosity inducing because we puzzle about things. We have to try to make sense of something that seems suspenseful. And experiences can be utterly transformative. We can grow so much from having experiences that stretch us and move us. But if there's too much of it and it's chaotic, it tests resilience. It tests your capacity to take in information. And when it's too much and it's morally injurious, when harm is the too much, you've got trauma. And trauma has to be addressed and integrated for experiences to be able to be taken in. So as the Dalai Lama says, through difficult experiences, life sometimes becomes more meaningful. But moral injury is when it doesn't become more meaningful. So I'm going to start now with the definitions of moral injury. And there are two dominant ones that people talk about. The first one is, of course, Jonathan Shay, who in 1994 began this discussion with his book, Achilles in Vietnam. This is his 2004 essay sort of summarizing what he calls moral injury. And he says it's a betrayal of what's right by someone who holds legitimate authority in the military as a leader in a high stakes situation. All three must be present for there to be moral injury. So in effect, that's actually not a definition of moral injury so much as it is a definition of what causes it. But his book, Achilles in Vietnam, describes the behavior that is caused by the king betraying Achilles and taking his bounty for being a good warrior, and how he has a character meltdown. So he calls it the undoing of character. That's a sign of moral injury, is a character change. And then the essay that so influenced me and a little over 10 years ago is the one by the Litz team. There's about 6 authors on this one. It's perpetrating, failing to prevent, bearing witness to, or learning about acts that transgress deeply held moral beliefs and expectations. This may entail participating in or witnessing inhuman or cruel actions, failing to prevent the immoral acts of others, as well as engaging in subtle acts, experiencing reactions that, upon reflection, transgress a moral code that severely and abruptly contradicts an individual's personal or shared experience about the rules or code of conduct. So it's a major moral transgression, and this is important. The individual also must be or become aware of the discrepancy between his or her morals and the experience, i.e. the moral violation, causing dissonance and inner conflict. That's the moral injury, the dissonance and inner conflict. And it sounds like, okay, so there's a conflict, but it's a painful, emotional conflict, not an intellectual one. And in 2016, his team, another team that he led, wrote a book called Adaptive Disclosure that has a protocol. For those of you who are interested, it's a very good book summary of moral injury as it relates to loss, what military culture is like and why it's important to understand military culture. And then there's an 8-step protocol they call adaptive disclosure that is one way to help someone process moral injury. They talk about imagining a benevolent moral authority and have a conversation with a benevolent moral authority and things like that. So in that book, they sort of summarize again the earlier essay definition as a moral injury is a syndrome of shame, self-handicapping, anger, and demoralization that occurs when deeply held beliefs and expectations about moral and ethical conduct are transgressed. It is distinct from a life threat as it is also not inherently fear-based. It can arise from killing, perpetration of violence, betrayals of trust in leaders, witnessing depraved behavior, or failing to prevent serious unethical acts. So those are the two prevailing definitions that people talk about. I think the major difference between the two is the emphasis they put on who is the actor or perpetrator in the situation. So for Shea, it's the leader. It's the authority of the powerful and leadership. And Shea's definition, I think, is actually quite useful in other arenas where people are traumatized by harm others who should have taken care of them caused them. So I think it's useful in looking at adverse childhood experiences and the moral injury that can come from being harmed by your parents or by other adults. The Litz definition focuses more on the person who's doing the perpetrating of the harm or witnessing and failing to prevent it, which is another serious breach. But they both, Litz has included it as betrayal, trust in leaders, and Shea says, well, someone in authority can be the self, can be the person themselves. So they're not in disagreement exactly. I think there's more of a difference in emphasis that's important. And I think moral injury is not limited to veterans, and I'll be talking a little bit about some research in other populations. But I think it's character. You can see it in a change in character that results from harmful experiences or life conditions that persons or groups are unable to justify, process, and integrate. So they can't make sense of the harm and integrate it. So they can't establish a reliable identity and meaning system that sustains their relationships and supports their own and others' flourishing. So it's a major problem. I put life conditions in there because people can be in situations like living in poverty where they just don't have any good choices, and whatever choice they're going to make is going to cause harm. And that's a terrible situation to be in. But the consequences of moral injury means that you mistrust people, you learn mistrust. So you're alienated from relationships, and you may have a sense of betrayal or failure, and you're withdrawn socially. And this is a chart that Bill Nash created that sort of walks you through some of the facets of moral injury. And the veterans we work with call this the Nash pie chart because they find it very helpful in understanding some of their own life experiences. But you can see there's emotions, relationships, self-concept, concept of the world, authority over, in other words, self-control, and unpredictability over time. And that's also important to know that a person can be fine for a long time and then suddenly get hit with their moral injury. And they weren't really fine, but they were functioning. And they were able to not look at their moral injury and bury that pain for a long time before it finally got them. So the continuity over time is important, and it can erupt and then go dormant, and erupt and go dormant. So it's not a cause effect and a result relationship to the self to have moral injury. And then this is the diagram that I think is most helpful for understanding some of the differences between PTSD and moral injury. So PTSD in the DSM is defined as an anxiety or a fear response, overreaction of your fear system to a situation, so that your fear system is making you behave as if you were still in the terrifying situation. And so there's hyperarousal, hypervigilance, flashbacks, just a constant state of anxiety, panic attacks, memory, and it's often because PTSD is memory that hasn't been fully processed in your memory system. You may not be able to actually remember what happened, but you may still have the symptoms. So my friend Rebecca Parker, who we write about this in a book together, was sexually abused at the age of 4 and had no conscious memory of that until she was in therapy after she was 36. So for 32 years, she could not remember it, but she had panic attacks. She had dissociative episodes. She didn't know what was going on. The dissociative episodes made her think she was very mystical and very spiritual. So that's PTSD. Moral injury is not fear-based. So the feelings associated with moral injury are what are called the moral emotions. And I'll give you a fuller list in a minute, but they're the kind of things you feel when you do something terribly wrong and harm results. So regret, shame, grief, sorrow, alienation. And then both can result in anger, depression, anxiety, lack of inability to sleep, nightmares, and self-medication to mask the pain involved. So they can look similar. That's why Bill Nash says you have to pay attention when you're treating somebody with PTSD to some of these other things that might be going on with them. And here's a little bit longer list of moral emotions. And they're what some people call pro-social emotions. Positive psychology has done a lot of work on moral emotions. And there are positive moral emotions like joy, like, those sorts of good positive emotions that make you pro-social. But even the negative or the difficult moral emotions, I would say, are pro-social. They're things you're feeling that are inhibiting your relationship, and yet they're a function of your relationship to harm and to someone else that might have been harmed. So guilt, shame, embarrassment, alienation, humiliation is one cluster. Those tend to make the person pull back and burrow down in sort of self-condemnation. And struggle inwardly. And then there's a more outwardly facing difficult set of emotions: outrage or fury, disgust, contempt, desire for revenge, and frustration. So those are often emotions that get expressed toward other people that are often really difficult to cope with. When somebody's berserkly angry and they won't calm down, it's really hard to know what to do. And it's because they have moral injury. And then there are the other sideline emotions that can go alongside all of these, which is sorrow or remorse. Grief is a major a part of moral injury, especially if you feel like that you've lost your God or you've lost your innocence. Or you actually lost someone you loved because of something you did. That grief is also a component of moral injury that's important. And I'm gonna take us through, I think, the next few things. And I want us to get a break because this is a very long webinar and I've already dumped a lot on your heads, I know. There is a handout, I hope you got it. It's a emailable handout with the notes of what I'm saying. So you don't need to remember everything and write it all down. Just stick with the highlights that catch your attention. This is a chart that Joanne Braxton, who's studied narrative medicine, created some time ago that was a chart about burnout. But as we discussed it, I think it's also a good chart to look at who is at risk for moral injury and burnout. And so I've adapted this one, and I keep changing it every year as I look at it every time again, because conditions have changed. And so you can see here, social worker, doctor, and nurse are highlighted in blue. These are the populations that have been studied for moral injury in the last few years before this chart was created. But it sort of lists risk factors. So if you do work that has life or death consequences, you're at risk of moral injury anytime you're working. If you have physically dependent charges, that is another factor for moral injury because physical well-being is really important. If you have ethical dilemmas where you sometimes don't know what's right, or you have to do something that you really feel isn't the right thing, that's an ethical dilemma. If you have emotionally charged participants or participants that are dependent on you and need you, or are upset because they're losing their memory or whatever, the emotionally charged participants is also a risk factor. Expected perfection, and when you're doing life or death work, perfection is the only acceptable alternative to not doing the right thing sometimes. So perfection, people have high expectations of themselves when they work in high stakes work. And then if you work in these kind of conditions, or you work in where you have limited choices, where you really don't have a lot you can do that you that require following rules, you can be at risk for moral injury because you have to follow the rules and you just know what you're doing isn't the right thing for a particular person. Also high risk for liability. If you are the responsible person and things go wrong, it's high risk. Isolated working conditions, having to work alone or not on a team can also be very difficult for people morally. And especially if you have a lot of responsibility, but not a lot of control, where your work is governed by laws and rules and things that you really don't have any control over. So as a social worker, you may have to take a child out of a family where you feel like that's the only loving environment they've known, and you know that putting them in a foster home might be really bad. So that's a life condition where there's no good choice. And so you can see the yeses are, yes, this is exposure to risks for moral injury. And at one point I had doctors that responsibility with little control did not to me seem like that characterized medical doctors, but it turns out that all the research on burnout and moral injury in doctors before COVID was about how they feel like they've lost control of being able to administer good medicine because of managed care. And a lot of them were either leaving medicine or killing themselves. So that the responsibility of little control has become a factor in, I think, a physician moral injury. And nurses, even before COVID, 48% of nurses in 2018 were considering leaving nursing. So that's another place with responsibility and little control, because you may be administering a treatment you don't agree with, but you have to do it. And if the patient dies, you're the one that did it, even though you didn't want to. And then the other professions are other places where there's risk. It's interesting that the one originally on this chart, the only one of the occupations at the top that hit all the factors with yes was the mother of a newborn, which I thought was interesting. And you can't see it, I think, on the screen right now, but this is in the handout, this chart, is teachers. I changed the yeses on teachers quite a lot in the last 2 years because their work now has life and death consequences. They're doing active shooter drills in schools. They have to know how to protect their students, not just their ignorance, but their very lives. And so the stakes for teaching have escalated quite a lot in terms of moral injury and burnout. And so there's a lot going on with what's happening in our society that has really escalated the risk for moral injury, I think, in care workers and people who work in social service sector. So I'm just going to walk you through a couple of the research pieces that have been done with new populations beyond the veteran population, and then we'll take a little bit of time for questions and then take a break. So this is the moral injury event scale that Bill Nash in 2013 created for the military and for veterans. And the same moral injury scale, we call it the MEIS, the moral injury event scale. This MEIS was adapted by a social sociologist named Wendy Haight at the University of Minnesota, and she's in the bibliography, to use it in child protective services. And she used this MEIS scale without the green questions, those she felt were very military based, but she used the rest of the questions in relation to child protective services. And she interviewed social workers. She did actual qualitative interviews. She didn't survey and do statistics. She actually talked to about 3 dozen social workers and then parents. And now she and I are working, she's doing most of the work, but we're cooperating on a project to interview children who've aged out of foster care, asking these questions. So I saw things that were morally wrong. I am troubled by having witnessed others' immoral acts. I have acted in ways that violated my own codes. I'm troubled by having acted in ways that violated my own codes. I violated my own morals by failing to do something I should have. I'm troubled because I violated my morals by failing to do something I should have felt I should have done. And I trusted, and then she inserted other words there, like my foster parents or my supervisor, whatever, to always live up to their core values. I trust myself to always live up to my own moral code. And she, in a number of essays, validated that moral injury is a risk in child protective services. And so we're hoping to be able to put together a processing. We decided to try to focus on fostered out youth, aged out youth until COVID hit. So now we're waiting. But the other way that this has been adapted is healthcare professionals. And so the list of the 11 questions or factors in the handout is slightly different from what I have on this slide, because I've actually organized them so you can see that there's 2 kinds of questions. One on one side is betrayal, guilt, shame, violating morals, feeling like a failure, feeling like God is punishing me. Those are the negative or the difficult pro-social moral emotions, but the other side are the positive ones. So they ask people both. Most people are trustworthy. I have a good sense of meaning as a health professional, and I have forgiven myself. And then the last 2 are just questions. Compared to before you went through these experiences, has your religious spiritual faith has it strengthened? And do the feelings you indicated above cause you significant distress or impair your ability to function in relationships at work or in other areas of life important to you? And so they have, the Monterey article is in press right now. And they have validated that this symptom scale works and that there's serious moral injury that should be addressed in healthcare professionals. So I'm going to pause there and see how many, if there are questions in the chat or comments or things I need to reply to. And I'm going to stop my screen sharing, I think.
Dr. Brock, this is Dan Bowman. I'm one of the psychiatry residents at UT. Really enjoyed your talk so far, especially the discussion about ritual and the way that ritual can be used to be able to help individuals in these different groups process through things and move from one transition point to another. I'm curious to know, has there been any research looking into what the prevalence rate of moral injury in the broader population, or perhaps specifically within healthcare or within the military? I know there's a lot of correlation studies that have looked at prevalence rates within PTSD populations. But I'm just wondering, outside of the group that's going to be, the selection bias that you get looking within a mental health clinic, what are the rates of moral injury like?
Boy, that is a really great question. I don't think any of the MEAS scales get at that. They can tell you what percentage of the people they surveyed had it, and the sample sizes are relatively small. So whether they can be generalized or not, I think it was the medical one found, I think, a 40-something% rate among healthcare workers in China and then in North Carolina. Those were the two populations that were tested. The one on Child Protective Services was qualitative, so I don't think it's possible to generalize from that to any kind of statistical number. But one of the more interesting studies on moral injury that I found is the one, Jordan, at 2017, that's in the bibliography, where they did a survey with 900 combat Marines to see how PTSD and moral injury correlated. So it's not necessarily a predictor of moral injury, but it is a study of what the relationship is between the two. And what they found was that combat stress by itself did not produce high rates of PTSD or moral injury in terms of the event scale. They're sort of about what you might expect, but not elevated. And that just may be because the military actually does train people how to deal with their fear and trains them for combat. And so Marines are ready and they go in expecting and know habitually how to deal with terrifying conditions. So they didn't find high rates. They did find some PTSD, but it wasn't as high as you might expect beyond the general population's rates. Where they found elevated, like markedly elevated rates of PTSD was with people who had betrayal as their moral injury. So there's some kind of relationship between betrayal and PTSD that's a link. What that relationship is I think not clear. But I think it validates actually what Jonathan Shea was seeing with Vietnam era veterans for 20 years at the Boston VA, is that he wrote his book on betrayal because so many of his drop-in clinic veterans were in really bad shape around, delayed onset of PTSD and other things. So why that's a finding is still being looked at, whether it's causative or coincidental or something else. That's the only research piece I know of that has looked at this in relation to moral injury and PTSD together. But I would suspect, here's my suspicion, that moral distress is just an ordinary human response to difficult life conditions. And most of us sort of have a way to deal with moral distress. If we screw up and harm someone, we may apologize or try to make amends or do something to take care of it. And so moral distress is something that's, I think, quite common in human beings. But when the moral distress isn't dealt with and it starts to accumulate over time because people who get tired at work may make errors or lose their energy for empathy or other things, and then things go wrong. Moral distress is not fixed by sleep or a vacation. Exhaustion can be fixed by sleep and a vacation, but if you're carrying moral distress, it's still in there. You may feel a little better because you're rested, but moral distress actually has to be processed. So if you accumulate it and don't process it, it can actually cause you to break. It can actually change your character and lead to a serious case of moral injury. Or a major devastation like an earthquake, a war, the Twin Towers going down. Those kinds of major devastating experiences at one time can cause people serious moral injury. I have a friend in the New York Fire Department who works with the EMTs there, and she says they're still carrying moral injury from 9/11. So I don't think I've answered your question about statistics, but I think it's more common than we know because people can hide it.
Dr. Brock, there's another question from Jennifer Lacrosse. What are your thoughts on the absence of ritual that is important in end-of-life care during the pandemic when families are not able to be present in the hospitals and allow for rituals that may be meaningful? And how may this translate to moral injury for both families and healthcare professionals?
Yeah, I think you're going to have a lot of delayed grief reactions. It's just, it's not just the grief for the person who's died, it's also the sense of frustration and devastation that you couldn't be there with them, or you couldn't bring the family together to grieve together. I know people have tried to do things on Zoom, and sometimes that's helpful. But I've had several friends who had lost a parent in the last few months and are really struggling with the fact that they couldn't go there, they had to stay home. So I do think that once it's possible to get back together in some form, that we need to find ways to ritualize that experience. It won't be a normal funeral experience, but it's and there are different ways that I think it could be handled. It's interesting, as I once attended a Buddhist funeral. It's not a normal thing I would have done, but one of my employees had her husband drop dead suddenly, and he was Buddhist. So I went to his funeral, and they have a ritual of putting the picture of the person who died in front of the group and inviting everyone not to speak about the person, but to speak to the person. Because they believe the spirit of the person who died waits to complete their earthly journey by the funeral act of having everyone who needs to speak to them get a chance to speak to them, and then they release them with a ritual bell process, so they go on to the next cycle of karma or their next whatever they're going to next. And that's the kind of thing that we might need, is to have a way for people to actually say goodbye to their loved ones in absentia, because I don't know that they're not there. That's the thing. And that's what I always say. I had a guy in prison who said I was going to get out and apologize to my sister because she was my rock, and I was going to apologize that I was in prison the second time because she's so good to me, and then she died and now I can't do that. What could I do? I said, write her a letter. You don't know she's not listening. So I think we're going to find ways to ritualize that particular way of losing someone where you couldn't say goodbye at the time.
Mm-hmm. There are several questions in the queue that ask for PDFs, copies of the slides, and this may be a question back to Layla, but is that available, Dr. Brock?
No, because the images are really hard to transfer. They're big. But the handout, I will say, the handout has pretty much all the information in my PowerPoint. And it's not exactly in the same order, but the information and data are in the handout, and the handout has an enormous list of resources that are the basis for most of what I say today. So your only option would be to take screenshots. I know people that do that. I do that at conferences. I take screenshots. But yeah, no, the PowerPoint's just not really easily movable. Yeah, sorry about that.
That's okay. Next question in the queue was, how does one go about processing moral distress?
That's the second half of today. I
Perfect.
have a whole lot on that. We just finished a 2-year pilot with veterans that's been showing good data. We just sent the article to a press. It's in the bibliography as submitted. We're waiting for the peer review process. Yeah, there's a lot more coming in the second half of this. So I think that it might be good to take about a 15-minute break. Can we do that now?
Yes.
And then we can come back for the second half, which is the part of what can we all do now?
Perfect.
Okay.
Thank you, Dr. Brock. We'll see everyone in 15 minutes.
All righty.
Thank you.
Okay, I'm going to restart. And I'll start with sharing my screen again. And here. There we go. All right. I said this half is the recovery half. One of the things that Jonathan Shea talks about in his work on moral injury is that moral injury is a very complex form of an identity crisis where your habits of life, especially if you've been in the military, a lot of the habitual ways that you live in reality are dysfunctional in civilian society. They just don't help. And then you have these devastating experiences if you've deployed to a war zone, or even if you haven't. And the betrayals and all of the, and your meaning system or faith system collapsing. So it's not a simple process to help somebody recover their sense of being a decent person worthy of love and respect. And so he argues for a more complex ritualized process that re-socializes people. And part of that can be some mental health support, especially with something like if the person does have PTSD. But he was really nervous about pathologizing moral injury as something that is a disorder. And that's why he prefers the term injury. It's a normal thing. He considers moral injury a thing that is not a disorder and yet is a profound kind of suffering that needs to be addressed. And so this diagram, this very complex diagram, was created by a student intern we had working with us when we did a conference at Princeton a few years ago, which I think captures some sense of the need for a collective support around a community or person experiencing moral injury, but all of the dimensions that come into a process of resilience and repair. And so when we did our program, now it's not advancing. Here we go. I think this will do it. When we did our program at Volunteers of America, Jonathan Shea and his colleague at the Boston VA, Jim Monroe, who's a psychologist, co-chaired a design team for us to create a model they thought would work to help with recovery from moral injury. And the team included 2 Marine Corps veterans, a Navy veteran, and Jim Monroe was an Army veteran himself. So we had plenty of veterans on the design team that could tell us, no, that won't work with veterans. And then we had a specialist in intercultural group, interfaith intercultural group facilitation, a specialist on military sexual trauma, a person who was a ritual specialist that understood ritual theory and how you can do spontaneous, or what we call sui generis rituals for a group that aren't sectarian, aren't identified with any particular religious tradition. And so the team worked for 4 days very intensively to create something that was first called spiritual resilience training. And several veterans said spiritual is, people who aren't religious aren't going to find that a useful name. And it went through several permutations, and we settled eventually on resilience strength training, RST. because one veteran said, you won't get anybody to sign up for anything that looks like therapy. So, but people like to be stronger. They like to go phys ed or something. He said, try strength. And so we tried that. So the name of it is Resilient Strength Training. And the committee, the design team, was adamant that it be a peer support model, that it not be a mental health professional in the room. And so this is a picture that was taken 2 years at the end of the 2-year pilot program, where veterans that had gone through the program did a workshop at a moral injury conference we ran in Los Angeles with the Department of Mental Health for LA County. And you can see they look pretty happy. They're also quite diverse. We had veterans in the program. We had 95 go through it. We had veterans in the program that range in age from 73, I think the youngest was 29. So we had some Vietnam era, Gulf War era, and the current OEF, OIF veterans as well. And a number of the front row, this was some of the people who also attended our workshop, but the front row is pretty much veterans who went through the program, except for me and one of the program administrators. And they all were also people who wanted to train to be peer facilitators. So once we did our first few groups with facilitators, we trained to the facilitator manual who didn't go through RST. Everybody else that became a facilitator had gone through RST. And it was 60 hours, which includes taking 2 surveys, one before and one after. And then we administer the same survey 6 months later. And the article that I mentioned that's in the bibliography in the handout, that's Barth, B-A-R-T-H is the lead author, that's in submission to the Veteran Study Journal. While I was talking and telling you it had been submitted, we got an email saying it's been accepted with minor revisions. So it's going to be published with our data in it. But this is a program that that design team helped us create. This is the first group out of New York that went through it through RST, and the facilitators are this man here, Titus, and Corinne. And they all called her little sister or mom because she's the only female in the group. But they were the co-facilitators that started the New York program for us. Corinne actually is a VOA employee, and she just wanted to do it as a service. Titus had been homeless for some time in the woods of Alabama, like for a couple of decades. And he wound up coming to New York and was in a low-income housing transitional program for VOA, and his caseworker, who became the administrator of this program, thought he might make a good facilitator, and he did. He was really great. He had put a bullet in his own heart at one point and lived to tell about it. And so he told that story of his own suicide attempt to this group. And this is the last day. You can see they're looking pretty good. The last day, they have a certificate ceremony, and they each get to say a little bit about their time in the program. And Titus got his facilitator certificate, and he said to the group, I pledge today that I will not die by my own hand. Mm-hmm. And I am inviting anyone else who wants to take that pledge with me, take it. And 5 more in that group took the pledge with him. And I wasn't there, but Titus says there were plenty of suicide attempt stories in that group. So that was very interesting. And this is our oldest participant right here, Rick from the US Marine Corps. He, on the second day he was in this program of processing, he called his girlfriend. He had a girlfriend named Maria. He called her and said, you know, I'm going to be a better person when I come home, and I think you're going to like me a whole lot better. And he has since married her and put her tattoo on his name on his arm in a tattoo. And this is Ramon. He's another Vietnam era veteran. And after he left the program, he reconnected with, he had a very awful father. He had a lot of childhood trauma that he has talked about publicly, so I can say it. And he went back to his natal family after he left this group, which he hadn't seen in decades. He just was estranged from his native family, and found a nephew, and he's reestablished a relationship with his nephew that he actually liked before but hadn't seen in a long time. And he volunteers time at a senior center to talk to seniors who don't ever have any visitors. I'm not sure if he's doing this during COVID, but that was a service project he wanted to undertake after he left the program. And the masks in the front are one of the first things they do when they get into the program. Is we give them time to make a mask of their military face, and then we use the masks in rituals. And we also use writing a lot. Some of it's free writing on a question, and some of it's guided meditation and then writing down the meditation. And we even had a few homework assignments that they were asked to do before they came to the group sessions in the morning. And most of the groups met continuously at a retreat center for 5 to 6 days to do the 60 hours. We had one group that did it for 6 weeks, 1 full day a week. And we had, I think, 2 groups that did 2-3 day intensive weekends. But the design team thought the retreat center intensive straight through was the best approach, because it allows you to help them develop habits as they're there. So one of the ways we use the masks in the rituals is we have them place their masks. We created a group altar in the middle of the room, either on the floor or on some table. The floor actually worked better because the altar kept accumulating things. But the bell there is always the thing that begins the process, and then we open with mindfulness breathing. So there's a ritualized beginning to every time the group comes together throughout the day. If they take a break, they come back to the bell, breathe, and do things. But we put the masks on the table, and when they share their moral injury experiences and stories, they're allowed to use, some of them choose to do this. They can use the mask either to describe it, to talk about it, or to wear it, or to talk to the mask. And so the masks become a sort of interesting part of the component of their sharing of their various traumatic stories. And as you can see, they're quite stunning. These are 2 that are in a film that a guy in Sacramento made about the program. And you can see the kind of emotions that this group was mixed, and I think the black mask was made by a male, and the other mask was made by a female in the group. So the masks were used in rituals, and then we called their trauma sharing when they have to talk about really painful stuff. We called it sitting in the fire, because the feelings are so fierce. And we teach them at the very beginning of the week how to listen deeply, how to listen without your mind engaged, how to listen with an open heart, how to listen without needing to say anything or ask a question, but just to take in the person's experience and feelings into yourself as a sign of support. And one of the ways we ritualized the deep listening time was to ask people when they were feeling deeply moved to put their hand on their heart so they could become aware of their heart rate and their breathing, so that they could stay with mindful breathing so they wouldn't be overheated emotionally themselves. And so we called that process of supporting someone sitting in the fire deep listening, and encourage them to share as much as they were comfortable from sharing from their writing. We always asked them to write the traumas, to write the stories first, so they had some control over how vulnerable they made themselves. So this is a ritual of fire that the first group happened in Palo Alto, California, at a retreat center. And we had a male facilitator, that's Robert, there, and a female facilitator trained there for the first group. But we wound up, the first group was all women because they were all living in a VOA housing, low-income housing area for people with children. And so they were all women. We had 7 women. And we wondered about Robert, and Robert was nervous. So we just told the group to tell him, you know, just to say that if they didn't really want him there, they could say that to be okay, and he wouldn't take it personally. And so they were told that if there was a point where they didn't want him in the room while they shared, they could ask him to leave, and no hard feelings. So what happened was that he himself is a survivor of childhood sexual abuse, and he was willing to talk about it, and it opened up huge things for the group. They all had military sexual trauma, and so he was beloved by the group. In fact, by the end, they were trying to marry him, one of the participants. But they asked, this group had not designed this in the format for the program, but the group asked the last night they were together if they could have a fire they wanted to let go.
Ceramic.
I think somebody needs to mute.
What is it supposed to mean?
We have some background noise. Somebody needs to mute. Thank you. So they asked for a burning ceremony. And so we got the retreat center to get us a little barbecue pit right at the bottom, right down there. That's the barbecue pit. And each of the women, they invited us as staff who were not in the group and didn't hear the stories, to come to this ceremony with them. They were so excited about doing it. And so they were burning things they want to let go of. So one of the women read a letter to her rapist forgiving him. Another one listed all the childhood traumas, multiple sexual abuse experiences, a mother who didn't love her, leaving the military and beyond, drugs and going to prison, losing custody of her son. I mean, there's a whole series of tragedies in her life. And she listed some of them. She read them off on this piece of paper and said, but I realized this week is that I have had so much pain in my life that pain was my comfort, and I didn't feel like myself unless I was in pain. And so I'm burning my pain. I don't need it anymore. So there were things that were said like that at this ritual, and then they would put the piece of paper in the fire and let the thing go. It was incredibly powerful just to observe this process that they were going through. And the woman who had all that pain in her life, we had a reunion about a year later, and she came with the son she'd lost custody of that she'd reconnected with, and the 6-year-old that she was raising at the time she came to the group. And the older son came up to me during just in a private moment, and he came up to me and he said, I know that this program is for the veterans who go through it, but you need to know it's also for the families, because you saved our family. My mother was so different when she came home from your program. She stopped being mean to us, and she would listen to us. And he said, I think it saved our family, which was completely unsolicited comment. I was sort of grateful that he wanted to tell me that, but I also wondered how she was doing, because she had had so much trauma in her life. We also have meditation built in, and time for people to reflect on whatever their meaning system, whatever is. We think lamentation is a really important piece. Part of the process of lamentation we do in the deep listening process is we let the person cry as long as they need to. The facilitators are careful about not offering comfort too soon. We have rituals about don't give somebody a Kleenex, don't ask them to take care of themselves, just take it in, cry with them if you feel like crying, it's okay. So we have quite a lot of lamentation that happens. And we use art a lot. It's not just the mask making that's helpful, but for people who have trouble with verbal memories or remembering, the mask can be quite powerful. They don't realize what they felt until they actually make the mask. But we also use music and singing. If we have anybody in the group who's good at leading singing, they just do, or people play their playlists to each other as a way to lift the mood at the end of the day when we had really heavy days. Music is really good for that. We also have had some movement and groups that danced at the end of the day. The groups sort of just have their own ethos, and each group does different things. But we also leave a lot of art supplies around, and in their evening free time after the group is done, a lot of them will go back and draw or paint or do something that's art, and that's another way to help them integrate and there's something about the creative act itself that's lifting up their spirits. And then we did an hour of spiritual practice every day, and we had different spiritual practices. The groups sort of make those decisions on their own based on what the facilitators are comfortable leading. And we train the facilitators on how to lead belly breathing, the mindfulness breathing, and to do short meditations or guided meditations. Some groups have actually used prayer. This is a group of women, Muslim women praying, but that's actually been relatively rare. And we accidentally, in that very first group, again, we were at a retreat center that had a labyrinth outdoors. And so the second day, I think the facilitators decided to try it, and it turned out that the labyrinth walking was incredibly powerful for the group bonding experience. And so we've built in, whenever possible, some kind of labyrinth or walking meditation into the spiritual practices that we do every day, but we give them an hour of some kind of way to calm themselves down to the point they can access their inner feelings and begin to process them, and also find ways to calm themselves for sleep. So we do them at the end of the day. There we go. And then the other thing that's a component of our program is at the second half of the program, the first 30 hours is all the trauma processing, the storytelling, lamentation, the grief. And then the second 30 hours is the rebuilding. And we do reflective exercises on what they used to believe and what they believe now. We use popsicle sticks. All week long, they're sharing popsicle sticks with words of affirmation for each other, or thanks, or messages to each other, and people start to accumulate a pile of popsicle sticks. And so in the second 30 hours, near the end of the week, we ask them to actually construct with their popsicle sticks the moral house of their group. And they spend an afternoon having to figure out what's going to look like, where the popsicle sticks are going to go. You have to use all of them. You can't leave any behind. And that was so laborious. We were going to cut it, and the facilitator said, "Oh, no, that's one of the best things that happens. The kind of conversations they're having as they're building that house are really, really important to their sense of connection to each other, as well as the progress they've made all week." And then the last thing in that 30 hours is we asked them to think about what the purpose of life they're going to have going forward that might be of service to others. And so they aren't required to make a commitment, but we ask them to think about that. And so a number of the participants have gone back to families they were estranged from and reestablished relationships. So that was what they wanted to do when they left. And then we have the guy who's talking to seniors at senior centers. A number of them decided they wanted to be facilitators in the program. That would be their service. And this is Team Rubicon. This is the outfit that the Marine Corps started quite a while back. They do disaster relief because they're trained for disasters. So they're putting their military training to positive use to help save lives instead of take them. And that's really important. So our data, this is very preliminary, and the article that's going to be published is the final crunching of all the data that includes the 6 month out. But this was a preliminary group, it's a very small sample, but the trends, as you can see, are that they start at baseline and stay improving. The last set of data showed it on several, like trauma exposure, that they started to go back down, but no one went back to baseline. None of the markers for all the things we tested went back to baseline. So So even if there was a dramatic improvement and then some decline, the decline was not all the way back to the set point they started at. And one of the surprises of this program, which we weren't expecting, but we were measuring because sleep is such an issue for veterans, is that the Pittsburgh Sleep Inventory showed that they continued to improve in their quality of sleep out at the 6-month marker, that they didn't go down on that. And that's a huge plus. Sleep deprivation is such a huge issue with veterans. And this is our one active program right now, or before COVID. The Florida affiliate used some endowment money to create a program. And so we sent people to help train their veterans and get their program started. And you can see Robert, who back there, who was in the women's group, he never got to go, and this is Corinne, who was in the New York group, who was everybody's little sister. The two of them never got an RST group of their own to go through, and they were still struggling with some of the issues in their lives. And so we offered to let them go through the Florida RST group so that they could have the experience themselves. So as our gift and thank you to them. And then the two facilitators were Jim, who's one of our regular facilitators who does lots. And then Bobby was the person he trained. And so Bobby's going to be now training other facilitators in Florida. So that's the Florida program we have. The other two, the Los Angeles and New York programs, we're going to raise funds to restart, but they were funded by Bristol Myers Squibb grant money as a pilot. And so we're trying to now, because we already have facilitators out there and program people. So we have taken, this is the next stage in our work at Volunteers of America, is that we have taken some of the principles that we've learned about moral injury processing and set up a moral distress program for frontline care workers during this pandemic. Because one thing that can happen is the moral distress can accumulate to the point that people break and experience moral injury. And so we're calling it REST, R-E, for Resilient Strength Time, REST. And I'll give you the URL in a minute where you can find out about it. But we believe, and there's plenty of it's been a lot of media reporting and opinion pieces and medical people talking about the epidemic of moral injury that's likely to come in the wake of this pandemic, because people who have very high stakes work are working in chaotic, uncertain, and worrisome situations. Where they're not just worried about their patients, they're worried about their own health and worried about their families. This is all layers of anxiety added into their normal workloads. And then this virus is, especially early on, was so puzzling in terms of how it works and what might even be used to save people. So it's chaotic. There have been leadership failures. The lack of PPE wasn't just manufacturing, it was also supply chains and all kinds of crazy things that were happening because there was not a coherent national policy or messaging process. So there was so much conflicting information. And so if your job depends on protective equipment and clear information and none of that is available, you can feel very betrayed by leadership. I remember a blog from a nurse who said, you know, that she just worked a long shift. She'd been working for 2 weeks straight. She was exhausted, and a hospital administrator had managed to secure a few extra boxes of PPE of some sort and had come down to the ER to let everybody know. And she was very proud of herself. And she said she just walked through to tell us that, didn't ask us how we were, didn't even ask if we were okay. So she's really furious about that. And it may be misplaced anger, but there's a lot of anger around things not going right to help you do your job the best you can. And then, of course, a pandemic means there's high risk for negative consequences. You cannot save everybody. I may not even know how to save everybody. And if you're working constantly and exhausted, it's easier to make mistakes or to get discouraged. So there's high risk. there's also an elevated risk because of the high standards and high stakes in healthcare. People expect a lot of themselves because it matters. And when you cannot do your best, it's devastating. And then, and this is a thing that medical workers share with military veterans, is a deep reluctance to seek help because it makes you the weak link on a team. And you don't want to be the weak link on a team and cause it to fail. So seeking help is sort of admitting that you might be a weak link. And the other is that if you go to a mental health specialist, it can be a career risk. If you're a doctor, you have to report a mental health diagnosis. And in the military, a clinician has to report to your commander if you get a diagnosis because you might be a security risk, which is one reason why in the military, military service members often prefer to talk to a chaplain when they're upset or feeling like they need help rather than a clinician, because a chaplain is protected from having to report. So career risk, weak link, these are all reasons, or they're just too tired and too busy. It's like looking for help. It's just one too many tasks, but there is that reluctance. And the kind of people who go into service work and caring work are idealistic, purpose-driven, service-oriented. And no matter how strong and high functioning they are, they can reach a point of compassion fatigue and lose capacity for empathy. It's just overload is overload no matter who you are. And I think the story of Lorna Breen in New York in late April, the ER doctor, mid-career, high functioning, just very successful, really good at her job, had a church group she belonged to. She had all kinds of support. Just was devastated by the amount of death, all those lines of ambulances. When she would go to the ambulance, that people would already be dead. And so she just, one of the things she mentioned, I think it was to her father, was all the dead bodies that she just was devastated by. So, and she was not someone who had a mental health problem or any of those things. And then moral distress is something that it can't be fixed by rest or sleep or a vacation. You can fix exhaustion with those things, but if you're carrying moral distress, it has to be talked about. It has to be addressed in some way, or it will accumulate, and it can break you into a state of moral injury. And moral injury is a much more serious condition. Moral distress can be a precursor. So it's important to address moral distress. And so since we can't do anything in person right now, a team of us at Volunteers of America decided to try to take some of the strategies that we thought worked well in the veterans program, the 60-hour in-person veterans program, and to see if we could create a program that would alleviate moral distress in health and frontline workers. So this is not a full-blown moral injury processing program, although we are looking at trying to do a 16-hour one online for moral injury. We're actually trying to sort that out right now. But we have this program that we started in May as a pilot with our own caregivers. So Volunteers of America has healthcare facilities, we have senior centers, we long-term care centers. So we have something like 16,000 employees that work in those capacities. So we try to pilot with them. And we did find the low utilization problem, but we're still working on that. And we have been able to run groups steadily pretty much for the last couple of months. But they're peer facilitated, and our veterans from the RST program were thrilled to be able to help with this program that were facilitators. And so some of them are facilitators in this program, and then we have some of them training facilitators for this program. And some do both. They both facilitate and train. The groups are up to 6 people, and they're 1 hour online via Zoom. And they happen multiple times at different times during the week. They basically begin after introductions with lessons in belly breathing, self-calming breathing, Then there's a short guided meditation to focus them on the purpose of the meeting. And then they are given time to share and after we explain deep listening, and to share with each other the stress they're carrying. And then to reflect on what they heard and give each other affirmations. And somehow it all manages to happen in an hour. So far it's worked. So that's what we've been working on right now during COVID. And if you're interested, you can go, and the current website is in beta, is sort of our first draft, and so it's going to be revamped in the next couple of weeks. But it gives you an idea of what the program is about. And there's a way to sign up for it if you're interested in being in one of these groups because you have moral distress, which I think a lot of us are carrying these days. And also we're in the process of recruiting facilitators, and you'll find information if you're interested in becoming a facilitator there as well. And we've just signed a contract with AARP to do a big program for them like this. So we're about to go big on several fronts on this. So this is just my last slide before I turn it over to conversation and questions. I think we have plenty of time for that, so that's good. So this is my editorial comment on what recovery from moral injury looks like. It's a lifelong process. You have to figure out what your meaning system is that can integrate the moral injury rather than setting it aside or pretending it didn't happen, because you can't do that. And it's a long journey. As I said earlier, some traditions are more helpful than others. And it turns out that if you have a very judgmental, punitive understanding of God or a higher authority, a higher power, it's actually more likely to deepen your moral injury rather than help you recover. And so there are all kinds of new books out in the last 2 or 3 years. I didn't put them all in the bibliography, but there are quite a number of them, of veterans themselves who've gotten doctors who are thinking about these questions. What does it mean to talk about original sin and God? Or what does it mean to look at the Bible and find recovery stories for moral injury in the biblical texts? We have, there's a really great anthology by Brad Kelly that's in the bibliography. He's a biblical scholar, and he's organized this anthology with some of the leading religious writers on moral injury, as well as veterans themselves who aren't religious, and other people. So it's a really good sampler if you're looking for some good authors to read, because most of the people in the anthology also have books themselves. So it's a nice, and it came out this year, so the stuff is very current. So I'm going to stop there and let us have a half-hour conversation about all of this.
Thank you, Dr. Brock. We do have several questions in the chat, and I guess we can begin with, if you do have a question, please put it in the chat, and Dr. Brock is willing to take questions at this time. One of the questions is, what will you be doing with AARP?
Oh, they have a hotline that has 40 volunteers who answer phones. They've trained these volunteers to answer the phone about financial fraud. And they receive 350 to 400 calls a day related to financial fraud of seniors, or sorry, they call them mature adults. And the call-in people, the volunteers, are in some distress because they don't have time with that many calls a day to really work with people who are emotionally melting down around it. They're sort of to give legal or financial or advice or resources or something like that. And so they've been puzzling about that. And then one of our CEO in New York knew someone at AARP and thought maybe rest would be good for them. Not folk. It's a kind of moral distress, but it's different from healthcare givers and or workers. So we had a long conversation with them and realized absolutely that we could train those 40 volunteers or however many of them wanted to do rest groups to do it. We're not going to call it rest though, because it's not a good term as you're aging. A rest home is not necessarily positive. So we're going to have a different name for it, but it's not entirely related to COVID. It's just a need. And we thought, well, we could do that. And unlike the healthcare workers, we would have an automatic feeder system into the program from the call-in center where the volunteers would be facilitators, and they could say, oh, well, I'm in this program. Why don't you come to my group? So we're looking forward to that. We hope we'll have the design done and be ready to launch in January.
Perfect. Thank you.
Yeah.
We do have several requests about contact information of individuals that are interested in becoming facilitators, and also a link to the website. Is that something that Layla can put up for us?
Yeah. I can actually find that slide in my PowerPoint.
Thank you.
It's basically www.voa, that's Volunteers of America, voa.org, and then /rest, R-E-S-T.
Great.
Pretty simple. I don't know that I need to.
Perfect. That's great. Thank you so much.
And my email is rbrock, R-B-R-O-C-K, @voa.org. So if you want to write to me, if you're interested in facilitating in the REST program, you can also send me an email and I'll forward it to the person who does our interviews and screenings. I will say that facilitators so far have talked about how much they enjoy the facilitation, that they really feel like they're doing a good service and that people do benefit. So far in the survey, we've been surveying the early users, and they report help as well. And we've had several of the people that went through it once want to be a facilitator. So far the program's succeeding.
That's great. Thank you. And I see that Cindy M has put in the chat box the contact address for online. We do have a follow-up question to AARP. Said the question reads, so will the AARP call-in center work with anyone to call in?
I'm not sure how the call-in center works. It's like a suicide hotline. It's like a hotline, and it's a general number. I know their membership starts at age 50, and it's a member service. So I don't know whether they screen people or not. But if you've been a victim of financial fraud, I would go to AARP site and see. It's a terrible thing, and some of the things they said were the most heartbreaking is the romance scam, where you're in love with this person, so you turn all your money over to them, and then they ghost you. That's a heartbreak that's different from some email that you clicked open and got messed up around. I think it's much a deeper kind of sense of betrayal.
Mm-hmm.
But there are lots of ways people get scammed, and I would suspect it's been increasing because, number one, there are more people in financial straits that need money, and more people online all the time because there's nothing else to do.
Mm-hmm.
Right.
Thank you so much for sharing that.
Yeah.
Another question, can you speak a little more about the labyrinth walking, what that is? They're unfamiliar with the practice.
Oh, sure. It's actually quite pan-religious. You see it in a lot of different religious traditions, and it's sort of been picked up by people who are spiritual but not religious as a practice, as well as by even Protestant churches. It's sort of part of the liturgical renewal movement in Protestantism. But so labyrinths, you can buy a canvas one that's printed. If you don't have a place to put one, you can have a portable labyrinth. So there are a lot of them. There are a lot of different designs. So I was on an island in the Hebrides at an Iona community a couple of years ago that was a very primitive place without electricity. And they had a little island you could walk to when the tide was low. And they had a tiny little labyrinth that was quite simple on that island. And then the famous one is in the cathedral in Chartres in France, the Chartres Cathedral. That was the one that was at the retreat center that we were at, because it was a Catholic retreat center. A labyrinth is just a pattern that is intricately done, and it's marked either by a flat floor and you follow that path, or by actually ridges like berms, so you walk around through the berms. It can even be bushes, so that you're actually walking through sort of bush tunnels. There's lots of designs of them, and some of them are simple and some of them are quite complicated. What happened with our group was that the Chartres Cathedral has, you go in one direction, you go into the middle, and then you come out on a totally different path that's woven through what you just went through and come out almost identical to where you went in. And our facilitators thought, okay, the women in the group, this is like a second day, I think they did it. We have a system where their name tags, they have a ribbon on the name tag, and red means you don't want to be touched, and yellow means maybe, but ask first. And red means don't touch me, I don't want to be touched, because we know that's an issue for people with trauma. So one of the women in the group had a red ribbon. A couple had yellows, but she had a red ribbon. And so they put people through the labyrinth 2 minutes apart, because they had a whole hour to do this. So and you walk very slowly at the rate you are breathing. You start the belly breathing, and then you slowly, it's a very meditative walking pace. You don't hurry, and you're invited to do different kinds of things. Some people are given a question to think about as you walk. And there is something about engaging your body that can undo a tight knot of a question that I used to run and get my best book ideas while I was running. So there's something about that. But you go through at a very slow pace. And what they asked people to do was to just breathe and notice the sky and the trees and the sounds of nature and the birds, and because it's a very beautiful place we were at, and to just look around, just to see what the world around them was like. So they 2 minutes apart, they clock through that way. Well, the thing twists and turns. So every time you go around a curve to go the different direction, you see people in the labyrinth. And so they were asked to wait in the middle and walk out later. So they instead of coming all the way through. So they were gathering in the middle. The first person was standing and waiting for all the others to come through, and there were 7 of them. So it's about a 15-minute wait. And they got into the center, and they just spontaneously hugged, including the red ribbon one. They just had this huge group hug. And she then ripped off her red ribbon and said, I need a green ribbon. So one of the other women tore her green ribbon in half so she could have half of a green ribbon on her name tag. And they were just joyful. They were just so excited. And when they debriefed it later, what they had realized was walking around and seeing all the other women in that labyrinth had helped them feel not alone anymore, not isolated. And it was such an amazing experience of connection, no words, just walking and looking, that it changed the whole atmosphere of the group when they were back in the room. The trust levels were a lot higher, and they got right into the sharing. So labyrinth walking has lots of different purposes. It's a meditative exercise to use your body to calm your mind so you can pay attention to your whole self, I think is basically what it's about. We actually, if we start our LA and New York programs again, we're going to buy a canvas labyrinth for each program. So we always have this possibility because it works so well. And lots of veterans I know use yoga, which is another spiritual practice that's really helpful. We didn't have any people in our facilitation group comfortable leading yoga because it's pretty complicated, but the mindfulness breathing and the guided meditation work and stuff like that was good. And then we taught the program administrators, we got them trained in an attention trauma release thing called TRE, which uses slight tremoring in the body to help release stored trauma pain. It's called TRE. And so our two program administrators are they went through the qualification to administrate it to a group. And so we've done those, the TRE. We don't do the same spiritual practice the same thing every day, but we repeat a couple of things. So because not all of them work for everybody. And with trauma-informed mindfulness work, you have to be attentive to how some people can't sit for very long or can't close their eyes. I have a friend who teaches mindfulness in a maximum security prison, and he said people in prison can be so traumatized they can't close their eyes. They're terrified. So we try to be gentle about what we ask people to do. And the TRE seems to be something anyone can do because you can sort of control how much you do it. Anyway, yeah, so the labyrinth was just one of the spiritual practices, but I think it's one of the more interesting ones. And even Rick, the Vietnam veteran, he had a cane and had trouble walking. He liked the labyrinth.
That's great.
Yeah.
Thank you. Here in San Antonio, we do have, I know of 2 labyrinths here at the Ecumenical Center. We have an outdoor labyrinth, and also at the Church of Reconciliation, they have an outdoor labyrinth, and there may be many more.
Awesome. Yeah. We did one. We wound up doing a group in Los Angeles that not at the retreat center, but in a different location because they weren't available. And we actually bought admissions to a place that had a park with a labyrinth, or I think it was free, but you had to have tickets. So we got tickets for 2 days worth of that and put them in the van and took them there.
That's great. That's great. We have another question. The question is from Anita. Are any of the veterans receiving disability for behavioral health issues? Are there any veterans receiving, that's the first part of the question. Second part, if so, might they underreport improvement out of fear of losing this disability benefit? Just wondering about the decline in improvements that you've seen.
Okay, that's a great question. A lot of the veterans in our program came through veteran services in New York and Los Angeles that VOA runs on federal grants. So we have homeless shelters, transitional housing, and low-income housing for veterans with wraparound services of case managers and a number of various addiction treatment programs, mostly AA models, I think. So we had a ready group to recruit for the program, but all of them were what I would call high risk because they've been recently or chronically homeless, and a number were in an addiction program. So when we designed the program with Jonathan and Jim, we were thinking around like college students or, something like, we weren't actually thinking about homeless veterans being in this program or recently homeless veterans. So when we started it and I realized that was going to be our population, I was a little nervous about whether it would work or not. And it turns out to have been just fine. And it was completely unrelated to anything they were involved with as treatment program or benefits or anything. It was just we had a kind of firewall around that. So we had a number of people in our groups who had had a PTSD diagnosis that were seeing the VA. And in fact, one of the guys that spoke at a class I had at Union in New York that I taught that came out of the program said, Said, I was seeing a VA therapist for 3 years. I thought I was doing better. I was okay. He said, and my therapist said I should do this program. And I thought, why? I'm doing all right. But he kind of thought I should. So he said, so I signed up. He said, by the second day, I was unloading things I would have never told my therapist. And so then he talks about what it meant to him to be in the program. We had a guy in New York, and he was in his 60s, I think, a veteran, Air Force veteran, who had been in prison for 23 years and under psychiatric care for 27 years. And he was in one of our low-income housing programs, a permanent housing program for veterans. And he was so terrified. First of all, he was gray, oily hair and a beard that he stroked all the time. And he had a scuzzy jacket on, and a hat that was dirty that he wouldn't take off. And he was like, I can't be here, I can't be here. And the only reason he had come was his only friend in the housing program. He wanted to come. And so he was gonna follow Jeffrey. And Jeffrey wasn't gonna leave the group. So Joseph was like scared to death, but he couldn't go home because Jeffrey wouldn't go back with him. So he's sort of trapped there. And the first day I saw him at lunch outside smoking, and he looked terrible, gray skin, you just look terrible. So I went up to him and I said, Joseph, how are you doing? He said, oh, it's too hard. I can't do this. It's too hard. I'm scared. I need to go home. And I said, I just looked right at him. I said, yeah, it's really hard. It's going to be hard for the next couple of days because it's just tough stuff. But I promise you, if you can get through the hard stuff, it will be really good. You'll get to the good part. And he said, no, it's just too hard. It's too hard. And I said, well, will you promise that if you decide to leave, you let me know? Okay. He said, okay. So he stayed because Jeffrey wouldn't leave. By then, I think it was the next or the morning after, it was really in the middle of the trauma sharing time. He showed up to breakfast without the dirty jacket or the hat. He'd taken his shower. His hair was all gray and fluffy. His beard was fluffy. He was ruddy skinned, sitting at a table, laughing. So he said at his certification, when he got his certificate, he said, you all did in 6 days what 27 years of therapy couldn't do. I feel like myself again. And he's gone. I mean, life has stresses, but I think what happens is that they go, you know, you have this baseline that's misery, and then you have this incredibly euphoric experience that's really fabulous, and great things happen to you, and then life hits again. And so I expected the scores to go down for the 6th month, but some of them didn't, which was the surprising part. But in any case, Joseph's was one of he said, I have permission to tell his story. He's proud of himself for having gone through it all. But he was one of the more dramatic visual just overnight he changed. And he's still in that low income housing. He's still with his friend Jeffrey. He every now and then buys steaks and has Jeffrey cook them for his whole floor. I mean, he's become much more sociable. And he's reconnected with a nephew he lost touch with. And he would been in a band, so now he's with his band again. So he's done things. And then we had just as another case of someone that we tell them you have to be cleared by, if you have under any kind of medical or mental health treatment, you need a clearance from your doctor. So we did have a woman who just didn't tell her psychiatrist. She'd been with the same psychiatrist for 7 years. And didn't tell her and just did the group. We didn't know any of, you know, it's self-reported. So she went back to her psychiatrist after her week and said, I knew you'd probably try to discourage me from going, so I just decided to go. And here's what I got from it, and here's what I need to work with you on. And the psychiatrist looked at her and said, I'm so glad you benefited, and you're gonna help me be a better psychiatrist now that I know what you need. So, and then this is my last story, is we had a guy who had a diagnosis of dissociative personality disorder. and talked to the program administrator 3 times on the phone because he was worried that he maybe shouldn't be coming. And she just said, "You sound okay to me. So why don't you come and we'll see. And if you feel comfortable enough, you can stay." So he came and I met him the first night. I usually went to observe since it was a program pilot. And we walked to see the sunset from this retreat center. It's a beautiful sunset over the Pacific. And on the way, he started telling me all his conspiracy theories about the, like George Soros is trying to take over the world and he's a Nazi, and all these lots of crazy conspiracy theories that didn't make any sense. And after the first 2, I realized he's a little off. This is more wacky than I can handle myself in a pleasant way. So I said, I think you have your theories and I have mine, and they kind of don't match very well. So let's just change the subject, okay? And he said, okay. And we talked about something else. And he stopped telling me all of his conspiracy theories. So we walked back and he went into the group and he did the whole week. And at the certificate ceremony, he was a little bit weepy and he said he'd never had an experience like this one, because most people that just don't like him. But what the group discovered is that he was quite intelligent and very funny, and he was able to give affirmations to others and listen to them. So he was fine in the group. And when the facilitators, the second or third day, they said, well, his first story about his childhood was that he was abducted by aliens when he was 6. And I said, so what did you all do with that? He said, well, it was his story and he was really upset. So we all went, oh, we're so sorry that happened to you. So they handled him fine. And he had a really good experience. I would not, I think, have admitted him to the group had I known. The staff administrator took the risk. I didn't scream. I mean, she was doing the work. I was just the project director observing, and I'm not a mental health specialist. So that was her judgment that he could handle it, and he did. So I was surprised that the most of the part we did have at the very end in New York, just to say, we had a group of veterans from Volunteers of America who were employed by the New York office in various capacities, who were seeing the results of the program come back into their buildings. And they all insisted that we do one for the VOA employees. So our last group was all VOA fully employed people who were grateful. So
Great, thank you.
So it seems to work on lots of people, or help lots of people. Yeah.
That's wonderful. Thank you for sharing that. We do have several additional questions.
Okay.
The next question is, to what extent, if at all, do you feel that the RST program draws from fields like narrative medicine to structure its critical reflection and deep listening activities?
Yeah, it's actually drawing from a number of evidence-based practices. That was the team we pulled together. These were their suggestions. So I'm not an expert in any of those areas. So I couldn't tell you exactly where the resources were that were pulling those things together, but the design team was all pretty much pastoral counselors, mental health professionals. So, or both. I mean, we had some pastoral counselors who also had social work degrees. So we did do that. Although I have to say, I in seminary in 1974, I think it was, took a class from a guy named Howard Kleinbell, who sort of pioneered group counseling for pastoral counselors. It was called Group Dynamics and Counseling. And a lot of what we do in RST isn't that different from the group stuff that I learned in that group processing around the stages of a group, and how we teach the facilitators that you need storming or they won't bond. So don't get upset if people are starting to get sort of testy, and some of those things. And certainly the writing activities are partly based on narrative medicine things. But there's also lots of good data on mindfulness breathing, on belly breathing. There have been good research results on a lot of these spiritual practices that have been secularized. And we ask the facilitators to, that altar becomes the ritual space of organizing the group. And the groups, every group has its own little ritual quirks that they do that's theirs. And so clearly the ritualizing lands the sense of the group, and the altar is the visual space. And the first thing they put on that altar are the pictures they bring when they come. And we ask them to bring a picture of their earlier self if they have one, or a picture of something that's important to them if they don't. So, so we also use those kinds of practices as well. But there's so much around human life that are things we do to help people that are actually pretty therapeutic. They just haven't been tested, like a lot of these religious practices. But we tried to do as much as we could based on actual evidence-based things that work. And we have a clinician in Florida that's, we always have a backup. That's the other thing I forgot to say, is we always have an on-call backup clinician for the facilitators, and we debrief them every night to make sure they're okay. We take really good care of our facilitators. And our clinician in Florida who does the backup work, but also does the facilitation or the staff administrator for the groups themselves. She has her own clinical practice, and when we took her through the training to become an administrator, at the end of the training, she said, well, you know, most of what you do in this group, like the artwork and the journaling, and these are all things that I do with my clients. She said, and I know they work and they're really helpful. She said, but somehow you get people to a place in 5 days it takes me about 10 months to get them to. And then she looked at us and said, how do you do that? Mm-hmm. So yeah, we use those strategies, but I think the how we do it is the intensity of the time together and the pure facilitation, where they're unguarded in what they're willing to say. Completely unguarded. No, well, not completely, but way more unguarded than they would be. We just have so many of them say, I would never tell my therapist this, but I told my group this. And then they'll tell me what they told the group. It's very funny. But yes, it's solid, good stuff that therapists also use.
Well, thank you.
Yeah.
We do have another question.
Okay.
And I'll begin. We have a critical incident peer support team at our hospital, and we find a lot of docs and nurses will not participate. And you did speak about that. I am wondering if you have any ideas to encourage folks to come to our debriefings. These are not medical reviews. They are confidential meetings which allow people to share their experiences.
Boy, that is the huge question. That's still a question for our program. We have tried several strategies. We've tried having senior administrators recommend the program. We've had testimonials from, we had some senior administrators go through it and then write these little testimonials about how they found it helpful. We've given all our facilitators business cards to help us recruit as recruiters. I just think there are lots of complicated reasons for people not, that like they feel too busy for the time investment, or they're nervous about opening a can of worms and not being able to close it again, or they're just nervous about anything that looks like therapy. One thought that we had was that it may look too much like just another EAP program. That is just some employer benefit that's just on the list of things that they could do that they're not interested in because it's a VOA program. So we're trying to move it outside of VOA now to see if that makes a difference. Like it's not an employer connected anything, it's just a thing. And we've wondered if something like this might work for those kind of teams that need to meet. It's completely confidential and peer facilitated. I don't have a good answer for how you get people to participate, but I do think there's certain professions where there's a deep reluctance to participate in things like they don't trust the confidentiality. They don't trust the space.
Mhm. It's an ongoing struggle.
Yeah, it is. Military veterans, it's the same thing. The same thing. They're
It appears to help. That's great. Next question. Could you say a little more about how persons who have suffered moral injury lose and then regain a sense of meaning or purpose in life?
Yeah, this will be the last answer too, so I think we're at the time limit.
Mhm.
It takes a while. It's not a simple process to rebuild a meaning system. And I think that part of the way our groups work that's very beneficial is that they're all week long, as they're struggling with things, they're getting input from other people who actually have, it's not a transactional relationship. It's just somebody that cares about them, cares about the group. And so they're getting feedback that validates them as people. It's like Mario, one of our participants, said, you know, he's been in prison for 13 years when he came to us. So he said, you know, he said, when I came here, these people weren't getting anything from me. They weren't getting anything. They just wanted to help. And he said, and they said things to me like, you're a man, you're really smart, you're really good. And he said, I never heard those things before. He said, and it made me feel good. He said, it made me feel worthy, which was his word. And I think that that's the first thing, is that you have to have other people who will validate that you're a good person, and that you can begin to trust your conscience again and participate in a thinking process of, well, what is meaning? If you've lost your sense of bearing in the meaning system that broke apart, how are you going to find a better one? And there's a film on moral injury called Almost Sunrise, in which two veterans walk from Wisconsin to Los Angeles to process their moral injury. And when they get to Los Angeles, Anthony, one of them, is feeling a lot better and Tom is not. So they both go back to Wisconsin, but Tom is still struggling a lot. So he winds up going to a power yoga workshop. And it's the body piece, right? The power yoga workshop that released in him this fierce anger he had for God. And he wasn't religious. He had grown up Catholic, but he hadn't been religious in a long time. So was just somewhere in him was this fury at God for having his best friend die next to him in battle. He just was so upset about it, so angry at God. And he didn't know it. He didn't consciously have that sense. So clearly that was the meaning system that was not working for him anymore. And so he had a conversation with a Catholic priest in which he did a little ritual in which he forgave God. And that was his first step at beginning to construct a meaning system, because he was so stuck on that anger. And what I've discovered is that with the veterans I've been working with for a long time, they keep changing. They keep rethinking. They keep playing with this idea and that idea. And I think, and this is the thing that Tyler Boudreau tells us, is that in his work on moral injury, is if somebody's telling the same moral injury story the same way every time, they're stuck. It's the people who keep massaging the stories, that keep seeing new angles and processes. They're actually processing in ways that help them build a meaning system. And that has to be, I think, to work, has to wind up being also a ritual system, a place where people gather. An individual meaning system doesn't mean a whole lot. It's not going to connect you to the relationships you need. So you have to find a way to put somebody in a community space where they can keep working on it, where that space respects that search. So it's a lifelong journey people are on. But if they hang in there with the journey, they will wind up flourishing because they're wiser.
Wonderful. Thank you, Dr. Brock. We're reminded in some of the dialogue on the columnist coming in through the chat that trauma-informed care is an important element. And we have a strong initiative in San Antonio, South Texas around that at the present time.
Yeah.
So we're grateful to Methodist Healthcare Ministries as one of our sponsors for today, together with the Ecumenical Center, the Center for Medical Ethics and Humanities at the UT Health Science Center. For your CEUs, please do follow the instructions that have been given and sent out to you. For that, Dr. Brock, do you have a closing thought for us?
Just to remember that moral injury is not a pathology. It is a part of the human condition, and the people who have it are the moral people. That they just need help with some life circumstance that unmoored their conscience.
Wonderful. Well, many thank yous from our chat box, and we're very grateful this evening. Dr. Brock will be speaking again. You can contact us for more information. I believe the conference may be completely full, but we're grateful, Dr. Brock, for your expertise and sharing with us today. Thank you so much.